If you want to know a little more about oceans, no need for a mask and flippers. In this program, we're going to tell you about phytoplankton, aquaculture, and the tides. Almost 3/4 of our planet's surface is occupied by oceans, and the only planet in the solar system to have oceans is the Earth. Because the Earth's mass is sufficient to maintain an atmosphere around it, and its surface temperature allows water to exist in a liquid state, oceans were able to form here and last up until now. On the other planets, temperatures are extreme, and as far as we know, all matter is either gaseous or solid. One of the most primitive life forms, plankton, inhabits the oceans where it plays a crucial role. Plankton consists of microscopic algae, phytoplankton, which feed microscopic animals, called zooplankton, which in turn, through the food chain, nourish all the higher forms of life. Like it or not, our fate is closely linked to the phytoplankton, which converts the sun's energy into living matter. Minute algae, for the most part invisible to the naked eye, inhabit the oceans and are at the basis of the marine food chain. These microscopic algae are called phytoplankton. Without them, the seas would be nothing more than immense spreads of lifeless water. Phytoplankton don't require other living organisms to survive. They are capable of producing their own food. For this reason, they are called autotrophic. Like the plants that grow on dry land, phytoplankton use photosynthesis to create their own nutritional substances from the energy of the sun, carbon dioxide, and water. In turn, they release huge quantities of oxygen. Over half of the oxygen breathed by living beings on the Earth's surface is believed to be produced by phytoplankton. This makes it as vital to terrestrial life as it is to marine life. However, phytoplankton can in some cases cause many problems. Normally, the microscopic algae follow a seasonal pace of growth. Scientists have observed, although they do not quite know how to explain it, that specific conditions cause a bloom among phytoplankton. This means that the concentration of a certain species of phytoplankton in a given area will suddenly and quickly increase substantially. Scientists believe that the triggering of a bloom is linked to the interaction of factors such as the water salinity, temperature, and the amount of sunshine. Immediately after a bloom, the concentration of algae can contain millions of organisms per liter of water. The density of the phytoplankton is so high that the water becomes colored by the pigmentation of the species of phytoplankton in it. The water can turn a strong red, green, or brown. But because it is often the red pigment that predominates among some marine algae, the bloom phenomenon itself is often referred to as red tide. When a bloom of this type is abruptly curtailed, as a result of a rapid change in temperature, for instance, the entire population of phytoplankton dies. The phytoplankton then become the prey of microorganisms that consume oxygen. The levels of oxygen in the water can therefore decrease dramatically. Many aquatic animals cannot survive prolonged periods without oxygen. so the end of a bloom can entail a veritable slaughter. Moreover, certain types of phytoplankton produce toxins. These toxins are very powerful natural poisons. They can kill several species of fish and can also accumulate in heavy concentrations in mollusks. The blue mussel, for instance, filters up to several liters of water daily. It can therefore accumulate, as can other mollusks, enormous amounts of toxins without being affected by them. All such mollusks then become extremely dangerous if consumed by man or animals sensitive to the toxins. Among the toxins that accumulate in mollusks is saxitoxin, which causes a paralyzing intoxication in human beings. During recent years, a number of people have suffered from saxitoxin poisoning, which in some cases is fatal. Once ingested, the toxin affects the nervous system. By disrupting the transmission of information between neurons, it provokes general paralysis. If excessive amounts of the toxin are ingested, it can prove fatal. 80 millionths of a gram is enough to cause death. And some species of mollusks, like mussels, can accumulate up to 50 times more than that. To prevent poisoning like this, researchers are currently attempting to clearly identify the factors that cause the sudden growth of phytoplankton colonies. To do this, they analyze samples of seawater collected in various areas and at various times of the year. Variables such as the degree of salinity, temperature, exposure to the sun are then observed. The samples undergo a variety of tests. For example, a device called a cytofluorimeter helps determine the exact quantity of algae in the water. This is possible because phytoplankton cells contain chlorophyll pigments responsible for photosynthesis. When exposed to certain light sources, the pigments emit a fluorescence. By measuring the fluorescence, scientists can assess the biomass, that is, the mass of living matter, hence the abundance of phytoplankton in a water sample. Scientists hope that understanding the factors that influence the sometimes disorderly growth of phytoplankton will enable them to prevent humans from being poisoned by such toxins. Long before we knew about plankton, the oceans were performing their nurturing role. Today we know of 20,000 species of edible fish, but of those, only a few are actually fished. Anchovy, herring, mackerel, tuna. Only 7 species account for 70% of all catches. Nowadays, some fishing areas are exploited to their maximum capacities, almost to the point of jeopardizing reserves. And yet, we know that handled with care, the riches of our oceans could be inexhaustible. Along these lines, aquaculture offers a promising alternative. Just as cattle farming replaced hunting, aquaculture may well replace fishing. Marine farming is gaining ground the world over. It already accounts for 10% of fish consumption worldwide. Aquaculture has been used for centuries for species of fish that are commercially viable, like trout and salmon. But recently it has extended to deep-sea fish like cod and halibut. A number of developing countries depend on products from the sea as their main source of animal protein. On a global scale, demand for these products increases by 2% every year, while stocks only increase by 1% during the same period. At that rate, by the year 2000, the planet will be facing a shortage of 20 million tons of fish and shellfish. Such shortages may well have a devastating effect on many populations of the globe. These people could greatly benefit from aquaculture techniques. However, every species of fish or shellfish has its own specific properties, so farming conditions cannot be applied systematically to all of them. Researchers are currently using advanced technology to develop aquaculture techniques to exploit new species of fish. As a rule, fish are fragile and do not adapt well to abrupt changes in their environment. To minimize mortality rates, the breeding environment must therefore be as stable as possible. But in addition to being stable, other parameters such as the temperature of the basins, the amounts of oxygen dissolved in the water, and lighting conditions are important factors for optimum growth and survival rates. Add to these requirement factors such as crowding in the basins, type and quantity of food, and water salinity for those species that live in salt water. To assess tolerance levels of species to be bred, scientists carry out comparative tests to determine ideal salinity levels for cod, for example. Several basins are filled with water with different concentrations of salt. Salinity tests require expensive installations. Seawater taken several dozen meters from the shoreline is kept in immense reservoirs. This seawater, combined in varying proportions with fresh water, is put into the test basins. The cod is then transferred from the storing basin, in which the level of salinity is the same as in seawater, into smaller test basins. So as to not distort the findings, all the other parameters must remain stable from one basin to the next. For several hours, a video camera records the behavior of the fish during 15 seconds every minute. By screening the videotape, the researchers are able to establish the level and rate of mortality related to the various salinity conditions. Observation of this kind requires a neutral source of lighting, so as not to introduce a variable other than salinity into the experiment. That's why the scientists use a red light source. Fish which live at depths of more than 15 meters, like cod, cannot perceive red. It would be totally useless for them in any event, because at that depth, all red light rays have already been absorbed by the water. Also, there should be as little noise as possible. The slightest change in breeding conditions, whether in salinity levels, water temperature, or food, causes stress to the fish. Such stress is measured by blood tests. After taking blood samples from the fish, variables are studied in laboratory, including osmotic pressure and levels of different hormones such as cortisone. The higher the level of these hormones, the greater the stress. Such tests enable scientists to avoid unfavorable conditions and optimize breeding techniques. The oceans are the source of many other riches. Salt, magnesium, sulfur, and all sorts of metals are extracted from the oceans. However, it's as an energy source that the oceans offer the most promising solution to the problems we face today. At a time when oil and gas are being depleted, when using them poses a threat to the environment, when nuclear power stations cause concern, we look to the sea. There is, of course, the energy of waves and of the tides, but that's not all. The oceans naturally concentrate solar energy into thermal energy, and the temperature differences between the two levels of water are now being used to produce electricity. Tides, currents, winds. Man has often been the victim of these forces. But today, he is beginning to understand these elements better. And if he can't always control them, at least he can protect himself. Every object in the universe exerts a force of attraction on other objects. That force is called gravitational force, or gravity. Gravity is what attracts the moon toward the Earth and holds it in its orbit around our planet. But the moon also exerts an attraction on Earth, and that attraction pulls all the elements that make up the Earth toward the moon. The Earth's crust raises by a few centimeters every time the moon passes by a given region on Earth. But fluids, like seawater, form much more flexible masses and are therefore more sensitive to the moon's attraction. This is why, since time immemorial, we have had tides. Tides can occur at given places on the globe twice daily. When the moon faces the eastern seaboard of North America, for example, the water can rise several meters. But at the other extremity of the Earth, in fact, at the remotest point from the moon at that time, another high tide occurs. While it appears that the water is swelling at this extremity, in real fact, it is the core of the Earth which, attracted by gravitational force, is moving toward the moon. However, the moon is not the only heavenly body which is responsible for the tides. To a lesser degree, the sun also exerts attraction on the Earth. But since the sun is much farther away from Earth than the moon, its effects on tides are roughly 3 times less. That's why tides caused by the sun merge with lunar tides and only alter them very slightly. If the sun, the moon, and the Earth are aligned, in one direction or in the other, the tides are greater. If the sun is located in an axis perpendicular to the moon's, the tides are smaller. Since astronomers are able to predict the position of the Earth, moon, and sun, the tides can also be calculated several months, even years in advance. However, the calculation of tide tables requires using a mathematical formula consisting of no less than 60 variables. The other planets also influence the movements of water masses, even though their effects are minimal. Moreover, a shoreline's geography, a bay's degree of openness into the water, water depth, are all factors that have to be taken into account for every different spot on the globe where tides occur. However, these tide tables only produce forecasts. The tides are also directly influenced by weather conditions, and these scientists cannot forecast months in advance. A sudden thaw, a rapid warming, or winds, for instance, can add to the strength of tides. That's why constant readings are taken by tide gauges set up along shorelines. Tide gauges provide navigators with accurate information on the daily tides. As a matter of fact, weather can pose more serious problems to boats and coastal installations than tides. Hydraulic laboratories have been designed to measure and possibly counter the effects of waves in given regions. Scientists first determine the regimen of the waves, that is, their direction, period, and amplitude. These measurements are transmitted to a computer, which controls the beaters of a testing basin. The beaters agitate the water according to the wave regimen generated by the computer, itself a reflection of a real wave regimen. To determine the height of the waves at various points along the coast, near a pier for instance, electric gauges are installed. The gauges produce a feeble current that varies depending on the water's level. This data, transmitted to the computer, enables scientists to measure the effects of certain coastal works on the waves. Therefore, by comparison, it is possible to determine which is the most appropriate type of breakwater to protect a coastal area. Studies of this kind help to make coastal installations such as marinas and fishing harbors safer. Man's life has always been closely linked to the oceans. At one time, we believed them to be filled with sunken continents, treasure-filled galleons, and gigantic monsters. In a few million years, perhaps it will be the vestiges of our own cities that ocean explorers will be seeking.